Schools aren't working for anybody. Students, parents, or teachers. Ideally, our education should cultivate well-rounded individuals attuned to their passions, personalities, strengths, and weaknesses. But sadly, schools were not designed to live up to this noble ideal. They weren't designed to teach us how to learn for the rest of our lives. They weren't built to help students determine how they can best live in balance and collaboration with others. They do not help cultivate that deep sense of the importance of knowledge for the sheer delight of knowing. Schools were designed to develop the labor force and citizenry, and to accustom each generation to their place in a hierarchical society. They've done their job so well that it is difficult for people to imagine a world without the principle of authority. We get so used to having other people tell us what to do that we cannot imagine a world without someone ruling us. This is not learned helplessness, but taught helplessness, and it's an epidemic. People are so educated that they can't think to do anything of their own initiative. The history of the education system carries persistent problems to the present day, prompting our need to explore solutions to revolutionize our approach to education for a liberated future. It is only with radical education and liberatory organization that the mentality of taught helplessness and internalized oppression can ever be undone. You know, the first essay I ever published on this channel was on the education system. Although I myself was homeschooled and self-schooled after a brief stint in primary school and up until college, I've long known that the school system sucks, so much so that I had to make a YouTube channel about it. Since then, I've been trying to learn and explore as much as possible, documenting my journey right here on this channel, exclusively supported on Patreon by viewers like you. Thank you. Though I have discussed this topic before, I want to reintroduce education to the conversation with a bit more research and exploration of solutions, particularly in light of my recent video on organizing anarchy. The bare-bones concept of education is not particularly new. Our earliest ancestors would have passed on knowledge and skills to aid the next generation in surviving their environment. I can imagine the ancient hunter-gatherer asking her son, "You think you just fell out of a coconut tree? You exist in the context of all in which you live and what came before you. Unlike you social insects, ants and termites, humans don't have their skills coded into their genes right from birth. We have to gradually learn all the skills we need to survive within our lifetimes. And because learned behaviors can't automatically be passed on to our offspring, each generation has to relearn the lessons of previous generations. However, we also get to invent new skills and technologies to adapt to new situations thanks to the power of imagination. With the rise of hierarchical civilizations came the rise of education systems as we might recognize them today. In ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, China, and Greece, the school was a tool monopolized by the ruling class to maintain their power over the masses, with literacy in particular restricted to those who served the interests of temple, state, and military authority. In the Republic, Plato advocated for the state to take responsibility for training children from the age of 3 to guide them towards an ideal conception of justice and into the social class and occupation best suited for them. By the Middle Ages, town, church, and monastery schools were the primary educational institutions in Europe, largely overseen by the Catholic Church, with instruction ranging from basic literacy to more advanced studies. Learning was largely fixed within the boundaries of the Church's interests and doctrines, so no venture in philosophy or science could contradict the faith. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, from northern India to Baghdad to the Sahel, there were centers of learning that covered math, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, and religion. In China, schools emphasized rote memorization and the teachings of Confucianism, with an imperial exam that selected officials of the state. All throughout, social conditioning was the name of the game. Following the Reformation, religious institutions in Europe began losing their monopoly on education. Eventually, Napoleon took complete control of the education system in France, modeling it on his military regime. Teachers and students alike were punished severely for stepping out of line. The initial success of Napoleon's military campaign would have a ripple effect on education globally, as his devastating defeat of Prussia would lead the Prussians to try and replicate the success of France in making national education a state priority. Johann Fichte, one of the leaders in the push for state schooling, argued that Prussia was defeated so severely by Napoleon's France because its citizens lacked cohesion, a commitment to the nation, and a willingness to sacrifice for its good. Fichte believed that schools should be used to create a compliant citizen who would be used to following orders, willingly submissive to a larger authority, faithful to the virtues of the state, and familiar with hierarchy. Thus, Prussian educational theorists created a model for schooling built around obedience, centrally controlled curriculums, constant fragmentation of days into changing classes at the sound of a bell, and teacher-directed classroom groupings. At the heart of the system was the primacy of the state, which levied taxes to fund this project. Children both belonged to and were the responsibility of the state, particularly in matters of schooling, which is an idea perfectly encapsulated in the German word Schulpflicht. Slowly but surely, directly or indirectly, despite even critiques by its contemporaries, this model of schooling would in some way infect every major education system in the world, supplanting previous approaches. The 19th century advocates of popular education are typically regarded as noble humanitarians. Yet despite the benefits of wider literacy, their intent and effect serve to integrate future workers and citizens into a rapidly industrializing capitalist and statist world. Meanwhile, in Europe's colonies in America, Asia, Oceania, and Africa, the primary purpose of colonial education was to facilitate the consolidation of colonial rule by stripping away indigenous learning systems and imposing the culture, traditions, and values of the colonizers onto the colonized population. Although there was significant variety in their implementation, colonial administrations and missionaries established schools to maintain that systematic imposition, as well as to train workers they could use to serve their mercantile ends. The result was the erosion of indigenous educational approaches, history, customs, and identity, and the internalization of a sense of inferiority and disempowerment that perpetuates a collective psyche of subservience among colonized populations well into the 21st century. But as we head into the 20th century, Frederick Winslow Taylor, the father of scientific management, was highly influential in the development of education systems and the expansion of industrial capitalism. His ideas were adopted, interpreted, and applied by school administrators all over the world, the aim ultimately being to increase the efficiency of the laborer, i.e. the pupil, to increase the quality of the product, i.e. the pupil, and thereby to increase the amount of output and value to the capitalist. According to American educator Cathy Davidson, virtually all of the protocols now in place for measuring academic success are based on Taylorist principles, on a system of reducing human qualities to measurable, standardized productivity designed for the assembly line. Taylor was apparently indifferent to the dehumanizing nature of his scientific management, whether it was applied in the workplace or the school. As far as he was concerned, an increase in efficiency would bring greater prosperity to all. You had to break a few eggs to make an omelette. As he once wrote, "In the past, the man has been first. In the future, the system must be first." It's this philosophically platonic, colonially cultivated, Prussian and Taylorist-inspired compulsory state school system that engineers our world today, serving the interests of those in power rather than fostering genuine personal development and autonomy. The school system has arisen in the context of and in service to the state and capitalism, performing its role in administration, colonization, industrialization, homogenization, pacification, and propaganda. Despite advancements in educational theory and practice, the core structure of compulsory schooling remains largely unchanged. Ultimately, schools serve to socialize people, and particularly children, into hierarchical society, to create workers and citizens, hence the long history of both anarchist and non-anarchist radical critique. Within the anarchist milieu, Emma Goldman notoriously inquired, what then is the school of today, no matter whether public, private, or parochial? It is for the child what the prison is for the convict, and the barracks for the soldier. A place where everything is being used to break the will of the child, and then to pound, knead, and shape it into a being utterly foreign to itself. It is but part of a system which can maintain itself only through absolute discipline and uniformity. In Anarchism, the Feminist Connection, anarchist feminist Peggy Kornegger wrote, "The lesson the child learns, from father to teacher to boss to God, is to obey the great anonymous voice of authority. To graduate from childhood to adulthood is to become a full-fledged automaton, incapable of questioning or even of thinking clearly." New African anarchist Ashanti Alston further recognized that to teach us to repress ourselves in the name of respect and obedience to authority dehumanizes us. The social repression and its learned self-repression is going to negatively affect a child's concept of self and ability to relate positively to self, others, and environment. People attempt to use schools as evidence in support of the myth of meritocracy, as they are compulsory and seemingly accessible to all, thus making individual success or failure a personal matter. However, while edge cases do manage to excel and overcome their lowest circumstances, the cards are stacked against the poor. Public schools are extolled as social equalizers, but even from the very beginning, the elite have had their own schools tailored to prepare their children for their elevated station in society. Historically, in some parts of the world, certain ethnic groups were barred from integrated education altogether. Even now, borrowing the observations of American economists Samuel Bowles and Herbert Gintis, we see the structure of school reflecting the projected station of their students. Secondary schools and high schools reflect the close supervision of low-level workers. Elite universities reflect the norms of professional, managerial, and white-collar workers. And community colleges and state universities reflect the requisites of technical, service, and supervisory roles. Don't be fooled. They're called public schools, but that don't mean they serve the public. Quite the contrary, they're among the most critical instruments of power. French philosopher Louis Althusser counted the education system in his critique of ideological state apparatuses, as they serve to naturalize the existing capitalist order and normalize exploitation, while producing workers with the skills, knowledge, habits, and attitudes necessary to fulfill their role in the system. Schools also operate as panoptic spaces. English philosopher Jeremy Bentham's concept of the perfect prison, the panopticon, enabled a single watchman to observe all inmates without them knowing whether they were being watched, creating a sense of constant surveillance and control. French philosopher Michel Foucault expanded this concept to other institutions, including schools, where surveillance by teachers and cameras, combined with mechanisms like examinations, regulates behavior and enforces conformity to institutional norms. For the years in which a child is most vulnerable, the school drills into them both necessary skills, such as reading and arithmetic, and the rules of the order established by class domination. This is not necessarily conscious or deliberate on the part of teachers, but rather the inevitable outcome of the structure of relationships among and between students, teachers, administrators, and their work. In Anarchist Pedagogies, American educator Robert H. Howarth echoed Emma Goldman's earlier critique, that under the enduring conditions of government-sponsored compulsory schooling, the child becomes stunted, that its mind is dulled, and that its very being is warped, thus making it unfit to take its place in the social struggle as an independent factor. This is strikingly similar to the motivation behind Brazilian philosopher and educator Paulo Freire's critical pedagogy in Pedagogy of the Oppressed. You see, Freire was especially concerned with how the relationship between oppressors and oppressed manifests and reproduces itself within teacher-student power relations. In particular, he was critical of how schools tend to apply a banking approach to education, as teachers act as authority figures who deposit knowledge into the subordinate and passively receptive minds of students. The banking model upholds and entrenches the binary of teacher and student. As Freire observed, the teacher teaches and the students are taught. The teacher knows everything and the students know nothing. The teacher thinks and the students are thought about. The teacher talks and the students listen meekly. The teacher disciplines and the students are disciplined. The teacher chooses and enforces his choice and the students comply. The teacher acts and the students have the illusion of acting to the action of the teacher. The teacher chooses the program content, and the students, who were not consulted, adapt to it. The teacher confuses expertise with authority, and the teacher is the subject of the learning process, while the pupils are mere objects. Because students are treated as objects under this education system, Freire argued that they have a tendency to develop necrophilia instead of biophilia, not in an erotic sense, but in a Freudian sense. Rather than having an affinity for life and living systems, students develop a static and mechanical approach to life, as if all that lives are things to possess and control. The banking model of education sucks the life out of knowledge. As
the teacher talks about reality as if it were motionless, static, compartmentalized, and predictable. Or else, he expounds on a topic completely alien to the existential experience of the students.
In fact, the banking model is incapable of truly transmitting knowledge,
which emerges only through invention and reinvention. Through the restless, impatient, continuing, hopeful inquiry human beings pursue in the world, and with each other.
Banking education must minimize or nullify the creative power and pursuit of true knowledge because the authorities in charge of the system do not want students to be able to understand or transform the world. That might threaten their power and profit. Freire understood that no oppressive order could permit the oppressed to begin to question why. Thus, a thoroughly educated person is thoroughly and unquestioningly adapted to the world the rulers have created, only capable of thinking and questioning within its parameters. Austrian philosopher Ivan Illich, a contemporary of Paulo Freire, also advanced a critique of the school system in Deschooling Society. He held disdain for the way that students were taught to conflate learning with memorization, grade advancement with education, and credentials with genuine competence. He argued that much learning happens casually or outside of formal schooling, yet schools maintain a radical monopoly on education. Radical monopoly is a concept meant to describe how a certain type of tool, in this case schools, ends up dominating the satisfaction of a crucial need, excluding alternatives from competition and making us dependent on them to meet that need. For the sake of specificity, Illich defined the target of his critique, schools, as age-specific, teacher-related processes requiring full-time attendance at an obligatory curriculum. Within such schools, another, hidden curriculum perpetuates the prejudices, privileges, and practices of our modern world, along with a set of myths that shape individuals' perceptions and behaviors. The first myth that schools perpetuate, according to Illich, is the myth of unending consumption, that continuous instruction leads to actual learning, and that schooling is essential for personal growth. On the contrary, he contends that learning best occurs through unhampered participation in meaningful experiences, beyond the limited scope of schooling. Next, the myth of measurement of values is the idea that everything can be measured, despite the fact that personal growth and success are not neatly quantifiable. Thus, students are conditioned to accept standardized measures of achievement and rank that inhibit their individuality. Illich similarly criticizes the myth of packaging values, or the idea that education is a commodity packageable in a curriculum that can be produced and consumed, rather than a process of genuine exploration and discovery. Unsurprisingly, Illich wasn't the biggest fan of universities. He argued that universities primarily serve to co-opt dissent and reproduce privilege, conferred through certification and socialization, upon those who conform to their prevailing norms and standards. In the desktop regulatory state, anarchist Kevin Carson is similarly critical of what Illich would call the radical monopoly of universities as it relates to credentialing. In his own words, the state subsidizes a certain high overhead, capital-intensive, and costly way of doing things, and then turns that high-cost input into a necessity for everyone by crowding out the alternatives. These institutions perpetuate a cycle of dependence on them, as even more fundamentally than merely processing students to be human resources of some institutional employer, the education system processes students to be managed by institutions in general, in every aspect of their lives. In my view, the education system, from inception to structure to outcomes, is fundamentally flawed and cannot be reformed from within in any way that would threaten ruling class interests. Any revolution will require unlearning, relearning, and transforming education on the grassroots level. Of course, this isn't a recent revelation. Anarchists have been consistently dedicated to developing alternatives to state schooling. In the interest of time, we can briefly examine two of the most significant manifestations of anarchist alternatives: Francisco Ferrer's modern schools and the free school movement. On the 8th of September 1901, not far from the sea's embrace in Barcelona, Spain, the modern school was inaugurated with 30 pupils, boys and girls. Anarchist educator Francisco Ferrer y Guardia had grown frustrated with the authoritarian, Catholic-dominated school system of his native land. As he saw it, the school is an instrument of domination in the hands of the ruling class. Having discovered anarchism in the clubs and bars of Paris after being exiled from Spain at just 24 years old following the 1885 Republican uprising, Ferrer wished to create his own experiment in libertarian education. 16 years later, after inheriting £1 million from a student of his in Paris, he was able to return to Barcelona and open his first modern school. Nestled in the surrounding gardens, Ferrer's Center of Learning sought to empower children with the freedom to seek knowledge and develop the potentiality of their whole being, intellectually, emotionally, and morally, without the imposition of authority. Although he was opposed to dogma, Ferrer didn't believe that education could or should be neutral in its delivery. In his own words, "I want to form a school of emancipation, concerned with banning from the mind whatever divides people, the false concepts of property, country, and family, so as to attain the liberty and well-being which all desire. I will teach only simple truth. I will not ram dogma into their heads. I will not conceal one iota of fact. I will teach not what to think, but how to think." Ferrer wanted his students to become adversaries of prejudice. Unfortunately, it would be difficult to find teachers and materials that could aid in this objective. He briefly opened a school to train teachers in his progressive ideals, but it was shut down by authorities. Then he had difficulty finding learning material that would not perpetuate falsehoods and prejudices, while retaining inspiration and facilitating critical thinking. Eventually, Ferrer found teachers, commissioned the materials he needed, and bought a printing press for the school. The school's publication, The Bulletin, produced educational material and showcased the writings of students, including a 9-year-old girl's inquiry on the morality of capital punishment and a 12-year-old boy's essay on the importance of sincerity. The essays reflected the modern school's ability to foster critical thinking and empower children to challenge social injustice. As demand for the Bulletin grew, it transitioned from an internal publication to a platform for wider discourse that shared the school's program, students' ideas, pedagogical articles, and reports on educational progress worldwide. Again, in Ferrer's words, we do not hesitate to say that we want men who will continue unceasingly to develop, men who are capable of constantly destroying and renewing their surroundings and renewing themselves, men whose intellectual independence is their supreme power, which they will yield to none, men always disposed for things that are better, eager for the triumph of new ideas, anxious to crowd many lives into the one life they have. Society fears such men. You cannot expect it to set up a system of education which will produce them, but you can expect Ferrer to try. The children were free to learn through practice at the school and during their regular visits to factories, museums, gardens, and other community spaces. And as Haworth noted of the school in Anarchist pedagogies, the children were also free from the nationalist messages of the state, exams, marks, rewards, punishments, and the gender segregation of the wider society. As Ferrer himself declared in The Origin and Ideals of the Modern School, having admitted and practiced the co-education of boys and girls, of rich and poor, having, that is to say, started from the principle of solidarity and equality, we are not prepared to create new inequality. Hence, in the modern school, there will be no rewards and no punishments. There will be no examinations to puff up some children with the flattering title of excellent, to give others the vulgar title of good, and make others unhappy with a consciousness of incapacity and failure. Ferrer made sure to include the parents of his pupils in the radical education, along with the wider community, and planned to open a popular university as well. As he saw it, higher education should be for the general public, not the privileged few, as every person has the right to know. This was all part of the anarchist tradition of prefiguration, building the new society in the shell of the old. Ferrer's example would inspire the development of modern schools across the world, including Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, Cuba, the US, the UK, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Switzerland, Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, France, China, and Japan. By 1905, there were close to 50 modern schools in Spain alone, and the main Barcelona school had 125 students. In 1906, Ferrer led 1,700 children in a demonstration for free education. Eventually, the authorities forcibly closed down the schools. Not long after, Ferrer was arrested and put to death by firing squad on charges of instigating uprising following the mass protests and general strikes in the wake of the Spanish War against Morocco. Even in death, his ideas lived on, most notably in Stelton, New Jersey, where a modern school persisted from 1915 to 1953. In Anarchy, a Graphic Guide, anarchist Clifford Harper quoted a pupil of the Stelton school named Ray Miller, who recalled that in Stelton,
personal relationships were the most important thing. People were allowed to develop their own potentialities. You didn't live according to rigid rules, but could do what you wanted, as long as you didn't interfere with the rights of other people. We did everything ourselves. We were gardeners, typesetters, cooks. We did everything with our own 2 hands. Instead of merely reading A Midsummer Night's Dream, we put on the play and put it on outdoors. Stelton was not only a school, but a community. It wasn't just education, it was living.
Another example of anarchist experimentation in alternative education comes from the Free School Movement, a series of voluntarily operated and open attendance schools, past and present, run along anarchist principles. According to Haworth, within free schools, punitive measures are put aside and classes are freely proposed, freely organized, and freely joined by anyone interested so that people can pursue their passions and interests without the intellectual regimentation of the traditional schooling model. For well over a century, anarchists have been developing alternatives in the interstices of dominant school systems. What we need going forward, in addition to the inspiration of other approaches, is to defend and complement these prefigurative practices with the organization and acts of confrontation and non-cooperation, without which these experiments will continue to be vulnerable to the bureaucratic reaction, censure, and police suppression brought on by the state. We can learn from anarchist and non-anarchist history and theory alike to contribute to our development of robust anarchist alternatives to the school system for the liberation of people of all ages and the development of a broader social revolution. Paulo Freire introduced the libertarian critical pedagogical idea of problem-posing education as an alternative to the banking model. No longer should students be mere recipients of information, but active and empowered participants in the process of learning. As he says,
education must begin with the solution of the teacher-student contradiction, by reconciling the poles of the contradiction so that both are simultaneously teachers and students.
As mutuality is the basis of anarchic social relations, our education must inevitably involve the mutual exchange of knowledge between teachers and students through dialogue and cooperation. Furthermore, adopting critical pedagogy requires us to teach social justice, as Francisco Ferrer did, as education is necessarily political. This isn't something we could put off for the future, but something we must implement right now to challenge the oppressive structures we live under, to foster critical consciousness, and to provide guidance for people to grow into an empathetic humanity. Ivan Illich's learner-centric alternatives in deschooling society emphasize the nature of education as a lifelong, interactive, and cooperative process that extends far beyond the schoolhouse. A good educational system should have three purposes. It should provide all who want to learn with access to available resources at any time in their lives, empower all who want to share what they know to find those who want to learn it from them, and finally, furnish all who want to present an issue to the public with the opportunity to make their challenge known. Illich envisioned decentralized and self-directed webs of education organized somewhat similarly to what anarchists might call free association. He wanted to heighten the opportunity for each person to transform each moment of their life into one of learning, sharing, and caring. He wanted to challenge the way that the job market depends on making skills scarce and on keeping them scarce, either by prescribing their unauthorized use and transmission, or by making things which can be operated and repaired only by those who have access to tools or information which are kept scarce. So he had 4 different approaches in mind for making educational resources more accessible to learners of all backgrounds outside of the monopoly of schools. The first is an open directory of educational objects. Those might be reserved for learners in libraries, labs, or theatres, or they might be in daily use in factories or farms, yet still available for student use either as apprentices or during off hours. The second is a database of people willing to freely share or exchange their skills with others, potentially facilitated through a point system where people level up through sharing. The third is a peer matching network meant to help people find fellow learners to collaborate with on shared interests and learning activities. And the fourth educational resource is a directory of educators detailing their qualifications, services, and the terms on which they are available so that learners can find mentors that they can build mutually meaningful connections with. Beyond these approaches, our society must also design educational opportunities in everyday experiences. Illich wanted us to fundamentally reimagine education, moving away from standardized, one-size-fits-all approaches towards a more personalized, accessible, and peer-driven model that values individual interests, connections, and experiences. A convivial model that enables individuals to define themselves not through marks, grades, and distinctions, but through the experience of learning itself, and contributions to the learning of others. Building upon Illich's vision of self-directed learning and Freire's emphasis on critical pedagogy, Kevin Carson introduced a few more potential building blocks for an anarchist alternative. Carson envisions the virtual integration of education through gaming environments and open course materials, alongside the physical integration of education within the community, as learners and educators are distributed through workshops, homes, museums, traveling groups, seminars, and workplaces everywhere. In particular, Carson sees a lot of potential in online learning through pirated textbooks, video lectures, and online quizzes, alongside peer-to-peer learning networks, to drastically reduce the cost of education while maintaining or even improving its quality for learners. Of course, such online resources will need to evolve beyond merely recreating the traditional lecture format toward creating truly modular and interactive learning experiences, but the potential is definitely there. One persistent concern for the potential of radical education is where credentials may fit into this flexible, unique, and lifelong approach to learning. It's nice to say that everyone should be able to learn about everything, but there are certain subjects where you may want some proof that a person knows what they're doing. Currently, degrees, diplomas, and certificates from established institutions are provided as proof that you've done the work and received a certain caliber of education. This need for credentialing will likely still persist even as the transition is made toward the liberation of education from the traditional schooling model. The question becomes how we maintain credentialing standards with this evolved approach to education. In the absence of state-mandated licensing or traditional college accreditation, Carson argues that some combination of crowdsourced credentialing and voluntary certification may resolve this issue. The idea of crowdsourcing credentialing involves using a social or professional network similar to LinkedIn to rate the credentials of others. Of course, the raters themselves would also need to be rated for credibility. The voluntary certification system would operate more similarly to what we used to, where individuals choose to be certified through professional associations, guilds, or specific courses that carry the weight of reputation. For example, there may be an association of doctors who are recognized for maintaining a certain standard of care and are thus preferred by most patients, incentivizing would-be doctors to seek accreditation from that association. Similarly, there may be an association of builders who are appreciated for their craftsmanship, encouraging their apprentices to eventually earn their badge within that association. What about young children? Don't they need hierarchy? How can we make sure they pick up at least the 3 R's of reading, writing, and arithmetic without traditional schooling? Speaking from experience, I believe young children will always benefit from an early foundation in such skills, as it empowers their ability to direct their own education as they age. But as an anarchist, I also believe parent-child and teacher-child relations need to break away from hierarchical conditioning. The upbringing of children can be a matter of trust and responsibility, not command and subordination. Of course, as anarchist Sean Wilbur would argue, tutelary and caregiving roles may still produce authority effects, but such effects can be significantly diminished with the strive toward anarchy. We must afford both greater autonomy to children and greater responsibility on the part of caretakers in the community to support them in their journey of self-actualization. In my eyes, something resembling traditional classrooms may still have their place in education, perhaps in passing on the skills of reading, writing, and arithmetic. But such classrooms should not possess the same hierarchical format or exist to the same extent that they do now. There's still room for theoretical instruction and spaces where skilled educators may choose to associate and pass on their skills. I would just expect that children are encouraged to learn and educators are encouraged to educate outside the traditional classroom setting. My vision for an anarchist alternative to the school system involves some combination of the ideas proposed by Freire, Illich, and Carson. I'm in favor of integrating education throughout daily life. I'm in favor of putting resources in common, expanding the library economy so that the now marginalized forms of education can breathe and flourish. I'm in favor of expanding the roles of education so that everyone is both teacher and student at once. I'm in favor of skilled educators, in association and independently, being empowered to distribute their skills to others. I'm in favor of sharing knowledge that challenges rather than reinforces the status quo. I'm in favor of structuring our cities and societies to accommodate the capacities of children to pursue their natural curiosities. I'm in favor of grounding our education in a relationship with our ecology. I'm in favor of every day, everyone learning something new. Here and now, we can break from the historical baggage of the school system and build a new, liberatory approach to learning. As I continually mention in my videos, such a transformation calls for social revolution. It calls for acts of prefiguration, non-cooperation, and confrontation to build and defend a radical reorganization of what is to what if. It is through participation in such projects that the consciousness of people develop, their powers expand, and their drive to seek greater freedom is unleashed. So whether you choose to build a virtual learning platform, open a space of educational encounter, host a skill exchange, organize an association of de-schoolers, start a radical book club, or put together a permaculture network, be sure to link your efforts to the patchwork of projects taking place all around you and all around the world to further expand the resilience, build the numbers, share the resources, and develop the momentum of revolutionary change. All power to all the people. Peace. Hey, so before you go, I just want to give a special thanks to Elliot Sang and Solarpunk Alana for lending their voices for the quotes in this video. If you want to learn about ecology and education specifically from an ecologist's perspective, you can check out Solarpunk Alana's video on the subject, linked in the description below. Thanks for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe, and share with your fellow peoples. Thanks to the seedlings, the saplings, and especially the roots for making all of this possible, including our newest members, Skeptic Buffalo 420, Daniela Sanchez, Karma Amanet, and Hypnosis. You can join these beautiful humans and support me too on patreon.com/sanetrue. Check out my other videos for a range of radical topics. Thanks again. Peace.